Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to have with us this afternoon Niall Ferguson and Pier Paolo Barbieri. Niall Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, where he served for 12 years as a professor of history. He's written several fantastic books. I've read quite a lot of them, amazing books. The last one I read is on Henry Kissinger. I strongly recommend. Pier Paolo Barbieri serves as executive director at Greenmantle, their consultancy on macroeconomics and geopolitical issues. And he's a senior associate at the Applied History Center of Harvard's Kennedy School and was chief strategist of the Bravenhauer Argentina Fund. Niall and Pier Paolo, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Thanks again. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mario, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion. We at Greenmantle are delighted to work with Itaú, and I think this is just a great opportunity to showcase the kind of work that we do and the ways in which we try to apply historical insight to contemporary problems. Not every year is historic. Last year was, by global standards, a pretty boring year, though you may not have felt it that boring in Brazil. 2020 is clearly a historic year. And I think it's when an event of the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic strikes that you begin to need history very badly to understand what's going on. Because most people in their lived experience have not seen anything like this. And therefore, the only way to get a handle on it is to apply history. So what I'm going to do in my brief introductory remarks is look at three aspects of this crisis and try to apply some history to each one of them. And then in the course of the discussion, we can dive into particular regions and particular issues. And Pier Paolo is here to back me up when we get beyond the range of my expertise, which certainly applies to Latin America. I'm no expert on your part of the world, but Pierre, as an Argentine native, certainly is. Let's start with the phenomenon of a pandemic itself. Pandemics are a bit like wars, or for that matter, earthquakes. They come in very varied sizes. They're not normally distributed. There's not an average pandemic. They're actually distributed according to a power law. All of these kinds of disaster, the natural and the man-made. And that means that there are a few very, very big ones and quite a lot of relatively small ones. In the case of pandemics, there are probably somewhere between 60 and 70 pandemics that make a historical list that are big enough to qualify for historians to think of them as pandemics. And it's important to recognize where COVID-19 lies in that league table. Very important, because if it's near the top, if it's one of the really big pandemics in history, then that has obviously major implications for how we should respond to it. The very worst pandemics in history were so devastating that it's hard to imagine. For example, the Black Death of the 1340s, a bubonic and pneumonic plague that swept across Eurasia, certainly killed close to a third of the population of the world at that time. And there was a Roman era plague, a plague that struck the Roman Empire, that was comparably devastating, so far as we can work out death tolls that far back. But those are the only two that were killing really large fractions of humanity. If you go to the next grouping, including the 1918-19 influenza, which was pretty devastating in Brazil, though even worse in Mexico, that killed somewhere between 2 and 3% of humanity. It was a devastating experience, but it's quite hard to disentangle its effects from the effects of World War I as it started towards the end of World War I. Now, when another Niall Ferguson, and I just want to make it clear that I'm not him, I'm not Niall Ferguson, the epidemiologist at Imperial College London, I'm Niall Ferguson, the historian at Stanford. When the other Niall Ferguson produced March the 16th, a report warning that without economic lockdowns, up to 2.2 million Americans would die and 500,000 British people would die. He was essentially saying that COVID-19 was as bad as the 1918-19 influenza, that it was likely globally to kill tens of millions of people. And I remember when he published that report, which, as you know, was very influential, my immediate reaction was, that's wrong. That's too big. It's not that deadly a virus, and we have better medical capabilities than they did 102 years ago. And so I've been arguing for some time now that we should think of this as a much less devastating pandemic, closer in terms of its magnitude to the 1957 influenza, which was a pretty big deal, probably killed around 1 million people worldwide and certainly caused excess deaths in many countries. But it wasn't 1918-19. It didn't end up killing 3% of humanity. It was an order of magnitude smaller, in fact. And my sense is that that's really a closer analog to COVID-19, and that we made a big mistake back in March. I say we, meaning the US, but it was also true in a number of other countries, of thinking that we were actually replaying 1918, thinking that we were dealing with the virus that would have an infection fatality rate of 1 or 2%. And that led us into a great panic. And in particular, it led us to the economically very disruptive measure called a lockdown. So I think the first point that I think history helps us understand is that this is not, disruptive though it has been, deadly though it has been for many people, this is not a pandemic as bad as some of history's really big pandemics. And therefore, it's quite likely that we have in some ways overreacted. And I certainly believe lockdowns in the United States caused significantly more economic harm than the public health good that they did. And we can obviously discuss this more in the discussion. That brings me to the second thing I want to talk about, which is the economic consequences of the pandemic. Unlike in 1957-58, when most governments did no lockdowns and schools weren't even closed in the United States, we've done a huge amount in response to this public health threat that has been very economically disruptive. Even the countries that didn't do lockdowns adopted a variety of social distancing measures that made economic activity in a whole range of different fields very difficult. And so when you look at the economic data as an historian, your first reaction, or at least my first reaction, is to say, my God, we're rerunning the Great Depression, but with the tape speeded up by a factor of roughly 12. It took 3 years to get US unemployment up above 20% in the Great Depression. The worst year was actually 1932. But we got there in 3 months. And indeed, it may be that the next unemployment number is even worse than the worst number of the Great Depression. I know Eddie Lazier, my colleague at Hoover, estimates it at something over 26%, which would be an all-time record. This is a really terrifying prospect, especially when you reflect on how difficult it was to recover from the smaller shock of the financial crisis of 2008-2009. So we're now back into one of those debates. What is the scale and how long will the duration be? And of course, what shape will economic recovery be? With a significant number of Wall Street and other economists arguing for a V shape, and others trying to make it sound nicer by calling it a swoosh, a kind of Nike swoosh, suggesting that we'll go down steeply and recover in something more of a gradual line. I think that this is a hugely interesting debate, not least because we find economists in rather different places from they were in back in 2008-9. Back then, for example, Paul Krugman argued that we were on the brink of another Great Depression unless we did massive Keynesian stimulus. And his view was that not enough had been done by the Obama administration. The deficit hadn't been large enough. Now, oddly, in the light of an interview he just gave to Bloomberg, he's in the V-shaped recovery camp and argues that this is going to be a relatively short, if sharp, recession, and we could come out of it much more quickly. This is, I think, kind of surprising because I can't help feeling that if the original Keynes himself were here, he'd probably not be very persuaded by this argument. It's a bit like one of Larry Summers's analogies. He said earlier on that the lockdowns were a bit like a vacation town going dark during the winter and then coming back to life on Memorial Day. I don't think Larry's making that argument anymore, interestingly, because I think he realized it wasn't right. We certainly aren't so optimistic about the speed of recovery, and I'll give a very Keynesian reason why not. In the general theory, if you actually read it, the central concept is the marginal propensity to consume. That's what Keynes says you've got to move up if you really want to get out of depression. What we're seeing in the data is there's been a massive rise in personal saving in this crisis, not just in the US, but in many countries. That's partly forced saving because people haven't been able to go out and spend, but it's, I think, more than just that. We can see that when we look at consumer indicators all around the world, even in places that are normalizing rapidly, like Switzerland, there is still a very, very slow recovery of consumption. And I think the effect of the pandemic and the policy measures that we've adopted has been to scare people. They're afraid and they're inhibited about doing things that they would readily have done before. And my guess is, although it is at this point a guess, that it will take longer than the optimists expect for people to recover their consumer spirit. That seems like the crux of the argument. How quickly will consumption recover? In China, you can get people to go back to work. China's pretty much in the vanguard of recovery. It's hard to get them to go back to shopping, and it's hard to get certainly shopping offline, and it's hard to get them to go back into restaurants that have to be half empty because of social distancing. Travel is way down in China, according to the latest data I've seen, and that's interesting because mobility travel measures are quite elevated in the US right now. When you drill down and look closely at where people are going and what they're doing, it's very telling. Switzerland has bounced back very quickly, and we hear from our guy who covers Switzerland that people are back in the streets and things look quite normal. There aren't even many masks to be seen. But mobility in Switzerland is up in public parks, not in retail, where it's still down something like 20%. And I would argue that you could see the same trend everywhere. The US states that are back to normalizing are in fact seeing great upticks in visits to parks. People want to get the heck out of their homes after lockdowns, but they don't want to, and they don't seem to be going shopping and going to restaurants. And I can't think of an economic recovery in history that's been based on increased attendance in public parks. The third and final thing I'm going to talk about is the political consequences of the pandemic. And this is a really complex subject, especially in an election year in the United States. I hardly need to point out that governments, particularly populist governments, have been given quite a shock by the pandemic. And in some ways, what's happening in Brazil is even more remarkable than what's happened in the United States, or for that matter in Britain, where populist leaders have suddenly found themselves on the back foot in the face of a public health emergency. I'll say just a couple of things and then I'll wrap it. I think the first thing is that a crisis, a disaster on this scale has quite unpredictable political consequences. I think they're harder, in fact, to assess than the consequences of the financial crisis. After 2008, very soon after, I said that there would be a populist backlash because it was so obvious that the financial crisis was the fault of the financial elites and the policy elites. They really had screwed up. I think it's much harder to see where the blame is going to be placed in the aftermath of a pandemic. People are somewhat inclined to believe the politicians who say this was a complete surprise, though actually that's not true. We'd been warning about pandemics for years before 2020. And therefore, it seems to me that it's somewhat up for grabs who gets the blame when there are really high levels of excess death, as in the UK, as in the US, and I think as in Brazil too. It's possible in the US that the economy, if it does spring back rapidly, in the way Paul Krugman suggests, will help Donald Trump, who will be able to say that he was the man who wanted to reopen the economy, and it was the Democrats in New York and California who stood in the way of reopening. The same is true of the public health emergency itself. If there isn't a second wave, if COVID-19 unexpectedly peters out in the course of the coming months, then again, I think Trump will be able to say that he was never alarmist, whereas others were. So I think it's still far from clear what the outcome will be on November the 3rd. The one thing that worries me is that the result might be so close, as it was 20 years ago in the election of 2000, that this country is plunged into a constitutional crisis, because I don't think the losing side would go as quietly as Al Gore did back in 2000. Imagine a scenario in which multiple state ballots are contested, particularly those where there's been large-scale mail voting, postal voting. This could be really, really messy. So I think the key point domestically is that it could be close. It could be very close. Finally, what about the geopolitics? China's going to be a big part of this election, with each candidate, Trump and Biden, trying to strike the toughest stance on China. Not very credibly in Biden's case. Trump, I think, has an advantage in having been almost the first person to call out China as a strategic rival back in 2015 when his campaign started. I think the most important thing about this pandemic may turn out to be its geopolitical consequences. More than most people realize, Cold War II already had started before the pandemic began. It was well underway last year. And the pandemic's intensified the antagonism between Beijing and Washington. It's made Beijing very strident. The Chinese government sounds almost Maoist in some of the propaganda it puts out these days. The Chinese Foreign Ministry's tone has been extraordinary in the way that it's tried to pin the blame for the pandemic on the United States when it so obviously originated in China. And the US has been pretty combative in response. Now, Cold Wars aren't made of words or tweets alone, so you have to look at actions too. And what we see at Greenmantle across a wide range of issues, the obvious ones like Hong Kong and Huawei, less obvious ones such as China's expanding empire of fintech and electronic payments, in all of these domains, Cold War II seems to be intensifying. And a big concern of ours is that if you can have a Great Depression happen at 12 times the historic speed, could you have the origins of World War III happen at 12 times the original speed? Could you find yourself at the end of this year facing not a Cold War, but potentially a hot war between the US and China over Taiwan? I mentioned that as a low probability, high impact scenario. And you're probably thinking, is he serious that we could end up with US-China war this year? If you're skeptical about that suggestion, I'd like you to go back to January and remind yourself what you were thinking when you first heard about an unusual new virus in Wuhan. Back then, I wrote, and we wrote at Greenmantle, that a pandemic was in prospect that would be global in its extent and would cause a recession in the United States. And not many people then thought we were on track. In fact, there was considerable skepticism from Greenmantle clients, not Itaú, if I remember, about that very negative view that we took. So when I tell you that history is moving faster than usual in the year 2020, I hope that you'll pay attention to that warning, because I have the same uneasy feeling about the way the US-China relationship is going right now that I had about the Wuhan flu when I first read about it back in January. With that, I'll close and invite questions as well as contributions from Pier Paolo.
We have with us today, thanks Niall very much for the intro, We have Eduardo Câmara, who is a managing director at Itaú Asset Management, and myself, and Mario Mesquita, the chief economist for Itaú. I'll start off with a question to you, Niall, about one of the legacies of this pandemic, which is debt. Right, we are seeing across the world an increase in.
Did we lose him?
Yes, I think we lost him. I can.
Economy?
Mario, we lost you, so we couldn't hear you. We couldn't hear. So okay. Could you start the question again?
Yes, sure, certainly. The question is, how is the global economy going to deal with the mountain of debt that is being accumulated, public sector debt that is being accumulated due to the pandemic and to the response to the pandemic? Are we in for a period in which monetary policy will need to be, subordinate to the need to accommodate increased fiscal sector?
Thanks for the question, Mario. The expansion of deficits, particularly in the US, is really very striking. Not many governments, certainly no developed economy, is resisting the temptation to allow public expenditure to soar above revenue. And at the same time, central banks are absorbing a really significant proportion, in some cases, all of the new debt being issued. And that always prompts a kind of familiar set of anxious questions about future debt sustainability and future price stability. So let me offer a couple of thoughts about this. The first is that these measures, although they seem unprecedented, aren't entirely, because in a sense we're running the economics of World War II in response to the pandemic of COVID-19. The federal debt, in the case of the United States, is on track to exceed its 1945 level in relation to gross domestic product in just a few years. This year's deficit is clearly going to be above 15% of GDP, which is a kind of wartime deficit. And the Fed's balance sheet, which is expanding at this astonishing rate since the advent of the pandemic, is kind of behaving the way it did during the war. And I would say, in answer to your question, that yeah, central banks have now to be essentially debt management agencies, which is what they were in the war. Prior to the showdown between Harry Truman and William McChesney Martin that led to the Fed Treasury Accord in the 1940s and right into 1950, the Fed's job was to make sure that the very large federal debt did not cost too much to the government. And that meant what we now call yield curve control, or basically setting interest rates in such a way as to make the cost of debt service relatively low. This is a variety of financial repression. It meant that bondholders did not get well compensated for risk in the 1940s. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that that's going to be the case this time around, even though we haven't had the war, or at least not yet. On the inflation side, which is a great concern, I think, to all investors, it's very difficult to get this right. And indeed, there are widely divergent opinions from economists, between those like my old friend Charles Goodhart in London, who expect inflation and relatively soon because of the supply constraints and then the very significant amounts of liquidity that have been pumped into the economy. And on the other side, someone like Willem Buiter, who's really expecting a pretty deflationary environment, a kind of secular stagnation part 2 story. And I'm kind of in two minds about this myself. I think as an historian, my response is it's all about inflation expectations. That's the key. And you have to ask not how big is your balance sheet, or how big is your monetary expansion, or how big is your deficit. The question is, what happens that changes the expectations of the public? Because as you know from the Latin American experience, if people have fresh memories of inflation, if they're accustomed to it, then they're much more likely to have inflation expectations move. Whereas in countries like Japan, where we've had low to even at times negative inflation for the better part of 20, even 30 years, there really is no sign of life in inflation expectations, and people expect 0% inflation. Historically, it tends to be wars that cause the big shifts in inflation expectations. Pandemics are by their nature quite deflationary, I think, whereas wars are inflationary. My guess is that if we stay in roughly the path that we're on, that is to say, we are in a protracted pandemic, we don't know quite when it will end, we're doing lots of offsetting fiscal and monetary policy to give relief to people, but people are saving a lot of the money that they get and certainly not spending it. In that setting, I don't really see how inflation suddenly jumps out of the lamp and starts up again. Certainly not in the big Northern Hemisphere economies. But if you get a big geopolitical shock of the sort that I hinted at in my introduction, then I think inflation expectations really could move. So this is a tricky question to answer, but I think history tells us it needs a shock bigger than a pandemic to cause people to revise their inflation expectations upwards.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Eduardo?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because we are hearing a lot of high-profile market commentators talking about the loss of the value of the currency. I mean, currency, history tells us that currencies eventually collapse, as you said, typically in war times. But what happens is that a lot of printing of money, and that's what we're seeing now. And then we see a lot of market commentators favoring real assets like gold or even Bitcoin, right? Do you have an historic perspective on that? I mean, what are you doing?
Well, it's certainly true that if there's a reason to fear inflation, then the smart strategy is to get on as much leverage as you can at the low nominal rates we currently see, and then go buy anything that is likely to retain its value in a crisis. Gold is a sort of historic favorite. Bitcoin, I think of as a sort of digital option on something gold-like. I mean, it's more volatile, but it's behaved somewhat similarly to gold. And it certainly has embedded in it a zero inflation promise, because there's a limit to the number of Bitcoin that can be created. But as a student of inflation, I began my early career studying the German hyperinflation. My observation is that actually those aren't necessarily the best ways of playing an inflation environment, that those who used leverage to acquire real estate or other productive hard assets were the real winners of the early 1920s inflations, rather than people who sat on gold. Sitting on gold actually backfired on a lot of investors, because it turned out to be possible in the 1930s just to confiscate people's gold by state fiat, or at least to demonetize it. So I think one has to be a little careful historically about advising on inflation-proof portfolios, because in fact it's not quite what most people assume. Gold's not really the best hedge against inflation, though I can see that it's a hedge against political or financial collapse, in the same way that Bitcoin is something that you might want to hold if you have low expectations of political stability and financial stability in the country where you live. I might throw that to Pierre in a minute just for further commentary on how this impacts fintech. But before I do that, let me just make the point that I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. In other words, how inflationary is it really for the Fed to print excess reserves that are interest-bearing as the kind of money that it creates when it buys assets under QE infinity, or whatever we're now calling this? The truth is that the Fed is not printing dollars and distributing them from helicopters at the moment. Yeah, people are getting checks through the mail from the Treasury with President Trump's name on the check, rather amusingly. But in practice, what the Fed is creating is excess reserves, not standard money, it's special bank money, and it's interest-bearing. So in reality, a competent financial institution, a competent central bank, if it sees any hint of an inflation uptick, will be quite easily able to curb that. Unless, and this is a critical point I didn't mention, the central bank's lost its independence and simply has become a channel of government finance. if we permanently revoke the Fed Treasury Accord of 1951, and if it turns out that Jay Powell is essentially going to be a Burdens-like Fed chair who essentially subordinates monetary and price stability to the political pressures that he comes under, then I think you could imagine the US getting back into 1970s territory. But I emphasize the strongly deflationary context in which all this is still playing out. You need something very big to happen beyond a nasty new contagious disease to break out of the secular stagnation framework that we've now been in for a long time. And Paul Schmelzing, my student who works on long-run interest rates, has been a strong proponent of what he calls a super secular stagnation that really is a centuries-long process that drives down interest rates. His work, I think, implies that you do need something like a war to generate a kind of meaningful spike in inflation and therefore in rates. Pierre, do you want to add anything to that on the Bitcoin front, and particularly, you're observing all this in a very different venue from me. You're in Argentina, a country with pretty terrible track record on just about every financial form of crisis.
I can never get away from that. I can never get away from that.
I had to bring that up just for our Brazilian audience.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a very clear contrast here, which speaks to the tone of the question. In Argentina, the central bank is issuing 3% of GDP, backed by no external ability to issue, and backed by no independence from the central bank and low reserves. So everybody understands that one way or another, this is going to end up in higher inflation. So inflationary expectations are going from 40% this year to around 60%, and I think that's the kind of the very best case scenario even when the economy is contracting at a 10 or 11% rate, as we saw in March and April. But you should contrast that kind of experience with a central bank that is not really independent to the experience of Europe, where what we're seeing is, and if you look at the ECB data published today, and more importantly, to the commentary from several members of the council at the ECB, the worry is very much deflation. Europe now has 0.1% inflation in the last reading, with 12 out of 19 members experiencing negative inflation. And yes, there were lockdowns, but the reality is that we go back to a situation where Europe hasn't had this low inflationary expectations for 5 years. So all the work done by Draghi and the QE program in Europe has been completely undone by the pandemic. And where you have governors like Visco in Italy saying, now is the time for the ECB to redouble its efforts. And this is coming after not just the purchases of sovereign debt from the ECB, but also the Franco-German agreement on the first potential joint issuance of any relevant size at the European level, backed not just by the French and the Southerners, but also by the Germans. So 500 billion of net new spending that is going to be thrown in the economy in the next 2 years or 3 years. And that the frugal four we don't think are going to be able to stop. So in that context, as in the cases in the US, as Neil was saying, the worry is that people aren't spending that money. So people may be sending you the checks and your average income may be up, but in a context of higher unemployment, you have a lower propensity to consume, and therefore the traditional channels of monetary transmission are broken, not just in Europe, but also in the US, which is why Powell said the other time, we are in the business of lending, but not in the business of spending. And that is the fundamental problem. And if you can see it in Italy and in Europe, the worry in those markets where there is credibility and where they're issuing interest-bearing securities, as Neil said, not traditional money, is very much the ability of people and the willingness of people to consume at a point of maximum uncertainty in terms of their economic future. If your job is not certain, even if your average income goes up because of a check by Donald Trump, you're not going to go spend it all.
Thanks, Pierre. I have a question here to Niall on something that he has been writing about more often last few weeks, which is the Cold War II. And one of his latest reports actually mentions a scenario in which the war warms up, right? So the question is, how do you see the future of the US-China relationship? And also, if we have to look where is a likely Sarajevo to be located, what is the flashpoint that we should be looking that might trigger a further sharper deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship? Thank you.
It's a great question, Mario. The allusion to Sarajevo, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is an interesting one because it reminds us that when that happens, it took actually about 40 to 45 days from that moment until the outbreak of war. And initially, most people's response was, oh, another assassination in the Balkans, no biggie, no big deal. It took a while for people to realize that this had lit a fuse that was going to blow up the world. And I was very struck by this analogy because it took about 40 to 45 days for us to get from reports of a new form of pneumonia in Wuhan to the realization that a global pandemic was happening. And it's a reminder that it's often not obvious to contemporaries when something really huge is starting. It's only obvious to historians in retrospect. The US-China relationship has gone from what I called chimerica back in 2007, this symbiotic relationship between the two economies, to Cold War II in the space of a little over 10 years. It was in 2007 that chimerica was really at its peak. It was obvious to me then that it was not sustainable. It was only a question of when it would fall apart. It lasted a bit longer than I expected, actually. And I don't really think Cold War II was a reality until 2018, when the trade war began to metamorphose into something much bigger. Particularly, I think of Mike Pence's speech in October 2018 at the Hudson Institute, which was really a remarkably important speech, greatly broadening the scope of the US challenge to China's rise. But actually, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, H.R. McMaster, had set that ball rolling with his new national security strategy, which actually came out late 2017. Now, this is where we get into the Thucydides trap that my old friend Graham Allison has written about in his book, Destined for War. Graham's argument is a kind of caricature of history. Basically, it says that whenever there's an incumbent power and a rising power coming along, at some point they're likely to end up in war, because that is mostly what's happened since the time of Thucydides. And I remember feeling a little skeptical about that argument, not least because with the United States and the Soviet Union, it didn't come to war. And actually, Cold War I is one of his exceptions that he talks about in the Thucydides trap. So I'm a fan of Cold War II. I think it'd be great if we could continue Cold War II. Apart from anything else, it would probably force the United States to focus on the kind of research and development it has to do to win Cold War II, because Cold Wars are essentially a technology race at core. And I think the United States, if it focuses, can win that technology race. The trouble is that, as in Cold War I, there's always a risk that you tip over into hot war. That nearly happened over Cuba, nearly happened several times, in fact. So the question you're asking is really, what's the moment that could tip Cold War II into World War III? It's not Hong Kong. The US can't really do much for Hong Kong, apart from, make speeches and perhaps impose some economic pressures on China. But Taiwan is a different story. And I want to just reiterate my point that you should watch Taiwan, because Taiwan is the ultimate objective of Xi Jinping's geopolitics. It is the ultimate goal that he has set himself to bring it back into the fold of the People's Republic of China, not just on paper, but in reality. And the ending of that strange anomaly, which dates back to the 1970s, in which there's a Republic of China that is in practice an independent state, but which the government in Beijing treats as a province, that's the thing to watch, because the current situation is very, very, very fragile. The US has a guarantee to Taiwan that dates back to 1979, but it doesn't have a war plan that is really viable in 2020. If China launches a risky but doable invasion of Taiwan, I don't think the US has a credible plan for reversing that, certainly for preventing it. And so that's the danger zone, I think. The US probably underestimates the pressure that Xi Jinping is currently under domestically, and it probably underestimates the readiness that he has to take risk, particularly on this issue, to distract attention from the fact that the economy has gone from a projected 6% growth to probably not much above zero. So I think there's a danger there that the US may miscalculate, and equally China may miscalculate. China may think the US isn't going to do anything because it's Trump, and therefore we can risk it. And it's often in those kinds of miscalculation that wars begin. So Taiwan, I think, is your kind of Sarajevo, or to be precise, your Bosnia. And the only question really is what exactly triggers it. Probably not an assassination this time.
Well, Taiwan is a real
Thank you so much.
big. Taiwan is a real big thing. I mean, is this a prediction? Do you really think we are going? I mean, they are going after Taiwan, or this is a? Because this is big.
The important thing is to attach probabilities. You know, we always try and do that in our work, Eduardo. This is not my base case because it's so risky for both sides. And I sense that listening to the Chinese leadership the past week or so, that they are still the risk-averse people that I've seen on my numerous trips to Beijing, that their top priority is still managing their own social stability. They are insecure as a political elite. If I think back over trips to Beijing when I've met senior figures, I'm always struck by how insecure they feel their rule is. Endless discussions about why imperial dynasties in China came to an end. I remember one time when everybody was on the standing committee of the Politburo was reading Tocqueville's L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, the Old Regime and the Revolution, because they thought it applied to China. So they are not, I think, super confident risk takers in the way that, say, Nikita Khrushchev was in the 50s and early 60s. I sense, therefore, that there's a low probability here that each side miscalculates the other side's risk aversion. A really important point to make is the role of Putin, because the closest alliance in the world these days is really between China and Russia. And Putin's advice to Xi, we don't know what it is, but we can guess, is already being taken, because China's waging the kind of information warfare in social media and elsewhere that the Russians were doing back in 2016. Very obviously, I see it myself, that if I write anything negative about China, a whole bunch of bots come after me on Twitter, and they're clearly Chinese sponsored. So there's something going on here that's new. And the other thing that's new, I think, is that Xi Jinping is a very different leader from his predecessor, Hu Jintao. And I think that those of the American leadership who were part of Chimerica, like Bob Zoellick or Hank Paulson, who say we can't decouple, we have to somehow resurrect Chimerica, don't quite get how big a change there has been under Xi, ideologically and in terms of foreign policy ambition. Everything from One Belt, One Road to the recent information warfare that the Chinese foreign ministry has been waging tells me that China is a much more aggressive player than it used to be. So while I'm inclined to think that both sides will pull back from the brink, as they did in Cold War I, I think we could get quite close to the brink. And that's the way to think about Cold War. It's all about brinkmanship. The point about a Cold War is not that it's guaranteed to stay cold. The point is that the hostility is very close to hot war. And the challenge for policymakers is to stay the right side of that threshold. It's a game for people who can calculate risk quite carefully. This was Eisenhower's great talent. The trouble is we don't have an Eisenhower in the White House. And that's a reason, I think, to be a little uneasy. So I'm going to give my scenario of a hot war, a US-China showdown over Taiwan, a 15% probability in a time frame extending, let's say, over 2 years.
Okay. Well, that's good. So the other thing you guys have been written a lot recently is about the comparison of what you call the Great Contagion to the Great Depression of the 30s. And there is more than only the fiscal policy reaction. I mean, other interesting topics are the technology sector of the 30s and nowadays, and of course, the gold standard and the dollar quasi standard. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
We had the idea a few weeks ago, I think, when we were looking at the US unemployment numbers and rolling our eyes in amazement, of doing a series of essays comparing this crisis with the Great Depression, because clearly the shock in terms of output and employment is comparable. It's just happening faster. Obviously, it's a different source, a different cause that we're dealing with here, because the Great Depression was truly financial in origin, whereas this is clearly something originating in a pandemic. But what I think we learned from doing that were a couple of things. First, that we are doing the opposite in fiscal and monetary terms of what the US government did after 1929. And that is important, because the monetary tightening that the Fed did after 29 was the principal reason that the recession turned into a depression. And I think we've learned from Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz not to make that mistake, just as we've learned from John Maynard Keynes not to try and balance the budget in a situation like that. So we're clearly doing the right things that history would lead you to think you should do in a depression-like situation. We also don't have the gold standard, which was the transmission mechanism that spread the US crisis globally until people started to get off gold and devalue their currencies. So there are some pretty huge differences there. But there are some resemblances too, both positive and negative. One resemblance which comes to mind, which is important, is although we're not on a gold standard, there is a sort of quasi-dollar standard out there, and that the dollar is the international currency, not just for reserves, but for transactions. And countries that have large dollar-denominated debts have been scrambling for dollar liquidity in a way that has led some of them into really dire straits. Think of Turkey, for example. So there's a sort of resemblance there, though it's not exact. More positively, what happened in the 1930s in the US was that a bunch of companies like General Electric, although they were in a depressed economy, were innovating in all kinds of incredible ways. And so when demand came back with World War II, the US was very much in the technological and managerial vanguard. And I think you can see the same thing happening now, where tech companies that are the likely beneficiaries of this great contagion are in fact in some ways already showing, and this is something that investors are seeing, showing the potential for the post-pandemic period. So not everything about the Great Depression was depressing. I think the point to emphasize is this difference of speed, though, that in the end, what made the Great Depression great was its duration as much as its severity. And it's difficult for me to imagine that our depression will be anything like as long as the Great Depression. And my guess is that a pandemic is usually a 2-year affair if there's a second wave, if contagion proves difficult to manage. And so you're probably looking into 2021 and towards the end of 2021 before you really see a sustained global recovery. But that's 2-year rather than a 10-year story. So it's certainly very great in terms of the magnitude of the shock, but I don't think it will be anything like great in terms of duration.
Thanks, Niall. Turning again to shifting geography towards Europe for a second. They now seem to be on the verge of finally issuing in size the common bond, which might be, according to some commentators, kind of an embryo of a common fiscal policy, which is lacking and contributes to this very weird situation where you have monetary union without banking or fiscal union, and that complicates life in Europe and policy making over there. Is it true? Is it Europe going to really use the cliche and turn this crisis into an opportunity?
Well, I'll say a few things on this, and then maybe Pierre can jump in, as we both study this very closely. And I think the simple answer is that a Rubicon was crossed, and particularly crossed by Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, in accepting not just an increase of the European Union budget, but actually the creation of European debt instruments to finance a really large 500 billion euro package that will channel resources to the most affected regions. So this is a big deal, and it certainly represents a shift in thinking. And it doesn't seem as if there will be any really significant German opposition to this. She squared away people within her own party, and there really isn't much dissent on the other side of the political divide. So this is very different from the situation in 2010, 11, 12, when really the German preoccupation with balanced budgets and the German resistance to any kind of transfer union was tenacious. And it meant that the crisis of that period was dealt with on a very ad hoc basis, with last minute agreements to bail out countries with troikas and conditionality, and it was all a mess calculated to maximize uncertainty. On the other hand, this has not solved the fundamental problem of Italian debt dynamics. It hasn't solved the nasty fiscal arithmetic of Italian public finance. Even if the transfer to Italy is quite substantial, it's not going to be big enough to remove risk from investors' minds about the sustainability of Italian debt. In the end, the crisis there is a latent one, and I think we'll come back at some point, probably when the current Italian government falls and Matteo Salvini, the man of the populist right, comes to power. So I think we shouldn't call this the Alexander Hamilton moment, a phrase that would have been meaningless before Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical made Alexander Hamilton famous. But for those of us who study financial history, Alexander Hamilton was always famous, and partly famous for solving the fiscal problems of the early United States by essentially taking the debts of the 13 founding states and consolidating them. That was Hamilton's achievement. Hamilton has not visited Europe this year, contrary to some excited commentary. Pierre, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the way we see it, it's going to be extremely difficult for the so-called frugal four to block what Angela Merkel has agreed with Emmanuel Macron. So we expect this proposal made by the Commission, very clearly based on the Franco-German agreement, which is the usual mode of operation of the European Union, and in particular the Eurozone, to go ahead. This should be close to confirmed by the 20th of June, when there is a key meeting of the Eurozone Council, and then the Commission wants to have it wrapped by July. So you could really have around 5 billion of net new spending to be done over the next 24 to 36 months in Europe, which is a lot more than the traditional MFFs, which is the 7-year budget that the European Union is ruled by. But to go one step further, we don't think it's the Hamilton moment, as Neil said, and the dynamics in Italy are particularly bad. And we don't just worry about the economics, which are awful, but consistent with the rest of the world and an epicenter of the disease. But more importantly, we worry about the political dynamics. We do not expect the Conte government to fall. Even if they were to fall, we expect the president to intervene to avoid elections at all costs and potentially bring in a technocratic government. But what we do worry about is all the data suggesting a very real change of perception in Italy by people who were formerly very pro-European and now more skeptical of Europe since the pandemic. So if that's going to change, it better change fast, because if there's a new election and this happens in that context, then BTP should not be priced where they are, despite what the ECB may do and despite what Macron and Merkel could invest.
Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned debt, and I have to ask you about the ongoing negotiations between Argentina and the creditors. What is your take?
I gotta go. I'm just kidding.
Likely to be.
Yeah. In Argentina, we think that there's been a lot of progress. Our view has always been that there would be no messy default, and that the government was very much against a messy default. Technically, they have defaulted, but the positions with bondholders were 15 points apart. Now they are 7 points apart. And there seems to be a very clear commitment from the government to get there, and especially from the president to avoid years of default. So basically a repeat of the 2001 to 2005 situation. And if you want to hear something controversial, it is our view that the Kirchnerites in the government want an agreement. They don't want 5 years outside of the world, and they do not want a return of the years of ostracism when they could only do business with Venezuela, Iran, and the like. And so despite what the media says, we think that Christina Kirchner will not block an agreement, and that we're getting closer in that direction, although there's still 7 points in MPV is a significant number. The government will deal with the Macri bonds first, leaving to July the exchange bonds, which have, for those of you who follow it very closely, much tighter provisions legally, and therefore a much better claim in New York courts.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe the last question, a very interesting topic for sure. While in China you have the tech companies working together with the government, what we have today happened in the US is Trump against Silicon Valley somehow. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, we just wrote a note on this, but it's not news to us, because if you go back to my last book, The Square and the Tower, it makes a very explicit contrast between China and the United States. In China, the Tower, which is the Communist Party, and the Square, companies like Alibaba, are very much intertwined, and it's clear that Chinese tech companies, while they may be notionally independent, ultimately have to accept requests for data from the Chinese Communist Party. And it's very clear from the way that, say, Jack Ma talks about this, that when push comes to shove, they do regard themselves, and have to regard themselves, as quasi-agents of the government. And that's why the Chinese are able to have a surveillance state, because ultimately the tech companies make it possible. And that, I think, is a profound difference. In the United States, by contrast, there is a deep antagonism, or at best ambivalence, between the federal government in Washington and the big tech companies in Silicon Valley. Now, the specific issue of Trump v. Twitter is interesting, because it shows that Trump and an important element of the Republican Party have finally decided to go after the tech companies on a specific piece of legislation, and indeed a particular clause within it, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, a mid-1990s piece of legislation that basically gives tech companies a kind of immunity from legal liability for content that they host on their platforms, while at the same time allowing them to be publishers if they want to remove content that they don't like. It's a wonderful piece of law for the tech companies, because it really does reduce their legal liabilities in a number of ways. And I've been arguing about this problem for a while. I did a paper in 2018 at the Hoover Institution saying that Section 230 needed to be revised, if not scrapped. Now that's become policy 2 years after I proposed it. And it's going to be very interesting to see where it goes. We don't know the small print of the planned executive order yet. And we don't know if the courts will be swayed by it, because ultimately you're asking judges to stop interpreting the law the way they currently do. This is a more interesting avenue of approach than antitrust, which was what the congressional parties ended up deciding to do. Antitrust actions against big tech companies will take years and years and years, and will probably be inconclusive. So I think it's an important sign, finally, that Washington recognizes that the big tech companies have too much power. They are, to a large extent now, the public sphere. And they do have a power to censor, to restrict access to that public sphere that extends way beyond the original limits, which were to keep child pornography and terrorism off the internet. I mean, it's now clear that Twitter, along with other platforms, has a politics, has an agenda, and that agenda tends to be skewed to the left and to the disadvantage of people on the on the right and especially on the far right. So battle has been joined. I suspect it might be a bit of a phony war because I'm not sure really that this executive order is going to change much. And in any case, and this is the critical point, although Twitter's important to Trump because he uses it to address his followers, Facebook is much more important. Facebook has way more followers in the US and worldwide. And Facebook ads are a much more important political tool in 2020, just as they were in 2016. And the key thing to notice is that Zuckerberg is not butting heads with Trump the way Jack Dorsey is. On the contrary, since last year, Zuckerberg has been saying, we at Facebook aren't in the censorship business. We don't want to do that. We're not even going to fact check political ads that appear on our platform. That's much more important than this Twitter issue. Because if Facebook sticks to that policy, then Trump and his campaign can use it again the way they did in 2016 so effectively, without any fear that their content is going to be policed.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Niall, Pierre. It was amazing as usual and a pleasure. And we'll talk again. It was fantastic. Thank you so much and have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Pierre.
Thank you.
And thanks to
Thank you, Neil.
Have a great
Thank you,
weekend.
Thank you, Neil and Pierre. Thank you, Mario.
Likewise. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ciao.